I fell asleep again on the bus. I had another vivid and violent dream about Ruth. When I finally woke up, the bus was sitting, totally vacant, in the Innsmouth bus station. My head was pounding, I could barely walk. I stumbled off the bus and fiercely vomited onto the pavement. As I wipe my mouth on my sleeve and take a look around, I see her. I see Ruth.
Father Dagon Season 2, produced by Dreadfalls Theatre and original soundtrack by Caesar. Welcome back, loyal listeners, to the second season of Father Dagon. If this is your first time joining us, feel free to start the story right here, or go back to the beginning of Season 1 and catch up on all the sordid backstories for the characters you're going to meet this season. And, if you haven't done so already, head on over to iTunes to rate and review the podcast, or tell your friends about us on Twitter and Facebook. This is Episode 1, Cobbled Streets, written by Victoria Snaith.
I didn't expect finding Ruth to be so easy. What's the odds of getting off the bus in this strange town of Innsmouth, and the first person I see is Ruth? I've thought about this moment time and time again, and there's a piece of me that says it could have been anyone. I was far enough away that the figure I saw, it could have been someone else. Another female. Brown hair, early 20s. But it wasn't. It was Ruth. I realized my head was pounding, my vision distorted. But even through all of this, I could tell it was her. Something in my bones, my gut, told me to look up at that exact moment. Call it detective's intuition, call it fate, call it whatever you want. But it was her. As the fog surrounding my vision began to clear, I thought back to the first phone call with her parents. The worry in her dad's tone as he described his missing daughter. The crack in her ma's voice as she tried not to cry. The way they talked over one another, eager to make sure I got all the details regarding the man she had disappeared with and the possible cult she had joined. This young woman was their baby, and it looked like I had just found her. From what I could see, Ruth was sitting on a bench, looking at something in her hands. My first instinct was to approach her, get her attention. But I was too disoriented, and I didn't want to scare her. God knows how deep the brainwashing had been. Let's say I had gone over. Let's say I'd gone straight to her and told her everything. She'd likely panic. I decided it was better to compose myself, watch from a distance, and then approach her when the time was right. The pounding in my head had passed, so I brushed myself off and casually made my way over to a small newsstand. That way I could get closer to where Ruth was sitting, without being noticed. I wasn't really paying attention to the man at the newsstand, but I remember him greeting me with a husky hello followed by a hacking, wet cough. He asked how he could help me today. I distractedly picked up a newspaper, eyes still locked on Ruth. It was 5 cents. It didn't matter what I picked up, really. I just needed something to help me fit in. It wasn't until now that I realized I didn't have any of my belongings. Only my wallet, notebook, and tape recorder. Had I left my case on the bus? No. But I didn't remember where I had left it. In fact, I didn't recall much of anything between leaving Ruth's dorm and arriving in Innsmouth. It didn't matter. The plan was to approach Ruth at an opportune time and bring her back to Arkham. By then my car would be fixed and I could drive Ruth home to her parents. I shouldn't have been in Innsmouth more than a day. I could do without my case, my clothes, and my belongings for that short amount of time. The man with the wet hacking cough told me for a second time that the newspaper cost 5 cents, obviously irritated that I had not paid him yet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a nickel. It was only then that I saw him. Bald, greyish skin, his pupils overly dilated in his gelatinous eyes. He thanked me with that coarse, husky voice, and I nodded, hoping he would take it as an indication I heard him. But in reality, no words came to me. Quite suddenly, without any warning, the pain in my head returned. It was a flash of intense heat, white hot, like lightning had struck my skull. Instinctively, I held my head in my hands, fighting back tears and the taste of bile in my mouth. I vaguely remember dropping the newspaper on the ground and the man in the newsstand laughing, although it could have been the sound of bitter mucus exiting his lungs. As suddenly as the pain began, it stopped. I took a deep breath and turned my gaze back to Ruth, just in time to see her rise from the bench where she sat and walk in the opposite direction. I started to follow her, careful not to be seen. Her walk was interesting to me. She didn't appear to be headed to her destination with any great purpose. Rather, she walked as someone who had only just woken up. Her soft but stumbling footsteps reminded me of early mornings where you stagger into the kitchen and try to make a cup of coffee with your eyes still shut. She was beautiful, even more so than her photos had let on. As I followed Ruth, I wondered if this man with whom she had eloped was kind to her. Her hair was in good condition, shiny, neat. Her arms were unscratched, no bruises. No sign she was being mistreated in any way. My gaze wandered down past the small of her back towards her legs. Her dress was a little torn, I noticed. Dusty on the back, as if she had been sitting on the floor. The tear in the dress could have been from anything. Snagged on her nail, perhaps. No indication of foul play. My eyes continued to wander over the soft backs of her knees, and that was when I saw she was wearing no shoes. And yet she walked through the cobbled streets as though unbothered by the dirt and cold stone beneath her. Maybe something was wrong. Normal people don't wander through town without their shoes. And her feet, her toes, were they webbed? I wasn't too far behind her at this point, maybe 10 feet or so. She turned a corner to the right. I turned to follow, and at first I didn't notice. I guess I thought in a small town all streets kind of looked the same, but what struck me first was that Ruth was gone. I had turned the corner. It was the only street she could have gone down, but she wasn't there. No alleys, no doorways in which to hide. She was gone. I wandered down the street a little confused, baffled. I stopped for a moment by a newsstand and tried to make sense of where she could have gone. The newsstand should have been my first clue. I'm a detective, a good one, but I hadn't noticed. Not yet. It was the cough that first alerted me. That wet, hacking cough. I had walked at least half a mile, turned only one corner, and yet here I was, back at that same newsstand. I looked at the guy behind the counter, and sure enough, the same man. I decided to walk back up the street. There had to be some mistake. Maybe I got turned around somehow. I passed the bench where Ruth had sat, walked along the cobbled street, and turned right at the same spot. No sooner had I turned the corner, I turned right back into the same spot next to the newsstand. This couldn't be. The longer I waited, the harder it would be to find her. This time I ran up the street, found the same spot where we got lost, and decided to try the next turning. Maybe I misjudged it the first time. Maybe she was down the next street. I took off running around the corner and paused, expecting to see Ruth in the distance. You want to know what I saw? That god-forsaken newsstand. The man behind the counter wiped his nose in his sleeve and asked, "You need any help? You look lost." Lost? What kind of twisted joke was this? I ran back up the street and decided to try again, and yeah, you guessed it, back at the newsstand. This time I walked slowly, taking in all that I could see around me, looking for anything abnormal, different, anything that would indicate to me what was going on. I stopped at a small alley. I could see that down the end there was a tall wall, a dead end lined with overflowing trash cans. The ground was unpaved, gravelled. The perfect turning to test my theory. I paused at the edge of the alleyway, looked back down towards the newsstand, took a deep breath, and stepped over the imaginary line into the alley, unblinking. And there it was again. Without any warning at all, the pain in my head had returned. I crumbled into a heap on the floor. I could feel the cobbled underneath me, and without opening my eyes, I already knew where I was. Choking back tears, I managed to stand. Unsteady on my feet, but upright, I chose another turning, closer to the newsstand this time. The pain made it hard to walk any further away. I tripped on a loose cobblestone and fell. Through my blurred vision, I saw, at the end of the road, myself. I saw myself on hands and knees, just as I was now. A shadow of someone approached me, arm outstretched, and it looked like they might have plans to help me up. At the same moment, I felt a hand upon my shoulder, and a familiar female voice said she would help me to my feet. Dizzy and weak, I stood. Using the wall to support myself, I made my way to a bench and sat for a while. The pain subsided, and my vision returned. I wanted that voice so badly to be Ruth.
Mr. Abbott, I would say it's a great pleasure to see you again, but you don't look in such great shape. No offense.
Anna Tilton. What in God's name was she doing in Innsmouth? Why?
I was on the same bus as you, Mr. Abbott. Didn't you notice? I guess, to be fair, you've had a lot on your mind, what with trying to track down Ruth and all. Although, it doesn't look like you're doing much tracking, does it? Now, there's no need to get so angry, Mr. Abbott. We're on the same side, you and I. You have no idea into what you are getting yourself. Ruth is but a small and insignificant pawn in a much larger game. When all of this is done, I promise, I will explain everything. Your brain has so much potential. The ability to hold so much information, you just aren't ready for it yet. But you will be. I'm making sure of it. Shh. Don't speak. I have something that might help you. I found Ruth's address. She's not there right now, but I reckon she'll be back soon. Maybe you should go and wait for her.
I stared, dumbfounded at the streets around me. Tilton obviously knew what I was thinking.
You can leave now. It won't happen again.
I stood. A piece of paper in hand showed directions to Ruth's home. I got my bearings and walked west, turned a corner, and it was a new street. I breathed a small sigh of relief and looked back towards Tilton. But instead of the bench and newsstand, was a tall brick wall lined with overflowing trash cans. I walked, maybe 10 minutes, until I reached Ruth's door. I knocked. No answer. Looked like the old lady was right. Ruth wasn't home, but the door was open, so I went on in. My heart jumped into my throat when I saw it. A white dress and veil, hanging on a cupboard door.
You have been listening to Father Dagon, Season 2, Episode 1, Cobbled Streets. Vincent Abbott was played by David Cox. Anna Tilton was played by Victoria Snaith. And music was created by Caesar. At the end of each episode, you can hear the soundtrack from today's episode in full, without the script. Caesar's music is perfect for getting you pumped up and ready for that morning jog. You know what they say, nothing burns calories quite like fear. But first, a short message from our friends at Tales from the Dark Dragon's Inn.
The Dark Dragon's Inn, since days of old, has told the tales of heroes bold. When darkness swept across the land, our players formed a merry band. The Scales of Justice was their name, to save the world and seek their fame.
Join us in the adventure with Tales from the Dark Dragon's Inn at tftddi.co.uk. That's tftddi.co.uk.
you haven't done so already, head on over to iTunes to rate and review the podcast, or tell your friends about us on Twitter and Facebook. If you haven't done so already, head on over to iTunes to rate and review the podcast, or tell your friends about us on Twitter and Facebook. This week's Monster of the Week is
J. Simpson.
This strange being appears in the myths of the Solomon Islands in the western Pacific Ocean.
J. Simpson.
It is clearly related to the merman and the mermaid, but unlike these familiar sea creatures,
J. Simpson.
it has legs, attached to which are fins. A larger fin, similar to that of a shark, sprouts from the head.
J. Simpson.
Also has gills and a sharp horn where his nose ought to be.
J. Simpson.
Commands a huge army of flying fish which savagely rend into pieces anyone foolish enough to invade their waters. The Solomon Islanders describe
J. Simpson.
as flying through the air carried by their fish army, or riding on the back of a rainbow during storms at sea.